Okay, I'm super happy to be with Liz Diller. We're both in New York, but we could be anywhere on any planet because we're in lockdown, right? We're in the Zoom world. But of course, it's a thrill to talk to Liz, not only because she's ridiculously intelligent. She's intelligent also, especially about TV. And in fact, curiosity I have is if you remove television from architects, right? Which architects die? And you're one of them, right? If I pull TV out of your work, you're gone. And that would be true, let's say, of maybe a lot of artists and architects in the 60s and 70s, the radicals and so on, who really felt like TV was somehow the future or the present or a subversion of all things stable. But in the 80s, maybe you're the only one for whom television is not just like in your work, but somehow your work is almost coming out of or through or undoing. I mean, it's just TV, TV, TV in lots of different ways. And I guess we're going to talk about all those different ways. But my first question would be just sort of the obvious one. Like, what the hell is TV?
It can't be answered in a single word. TV is a lot of things. First of all, it's the thing. It's the object. I grew up with cathode ray, and now TVs are really so flat and thin. So it's the thing. Then there's a romance with that very thing. Mm-hmm. TV is also the broadcast stuff, right? Which is what fuels a lot of political opinions. It's what it's what we share in a kind of this electronic meld societally. But also, I mean, for me, it's a broad category of moving image and time-based media, because a lot of our work had to do with surveillance TV or it had to do with real-time video, and they share a lot of the same properties. So it's stuff to do ultimately with 2D, with 3Ds, but not the same 3D that architecture deals with. 2Ds in terms of dimension and time. Right. So it's a complex medium. And then when you start to put all of those 4 dimensions together, it gets even more complex.
Right. So the 2D, when you mentioned 2D and 3D, like the architects think that they know about that stuff, right? And then when you say 4D, maybe architects say, oh yes, architecture is sort of like moving in time and stuff like that. But you mean something else, right? Like a whole other way of thinking 2D, 3D, and 4D that is not familiar to architects, or even is somehow, am I pushing too hard, like resisting that? Like you are thinking the TV 2D, 3D, 4D in ways that undo the way that architects normally think, or at least that's the way I see your work.
I'll just say that the sort of the very, very sort of bottom line irreducible is time-based.
Right.
Architecture is time-based. Typically when we draw our buildings or spaces, we draw them with either flat drawings or we model them digitally so we can spin around and see them in 3D. But that's not the way architecture is experienced, perceived, or designed. And I have always, and our studio always thinks about the sort of the way things are used, the way they change over time, the way that you can't just see it ahead of you. And, very quickly you understand your peripheral vision is really wide. And there's something about real timeness that becomes very, very important. And you can't predict that when you build a building, because making architecture is incredibly slow and geo-fixed. But architecture is never perceived that way. It's never used that way. So there's like a missing dimension always. And if you can't think that way, then there's something that, in the end, projects don't hold up that well, I think.
Oh, so that's so interesting. You're saying something quite different than what I said, right? I mean, what I said was sort of, architecture is boring, basically, and along comes TV to shake things up. And it sounds like what you're saying is actually architecture was always very complex and experienced and produced in very complex 4-dimensional ways. And we didn't quite tune into that. And TV allows you to do that. So it's actually, TV is not like a revolution, like let's throw away architecture. It's like let's do architecture now.
No,
Finally.
I mean, like putting all that aside, putting content aside in broadcast TV,
Yeah.
and all that has shaped me and you and others that live off of it, there's something fundamental that is so much part of our everyday lives that's missing out of architecture, you know, in terms of the standards of the way we discuss architecture, the way we draw it and communicate it, the way we design. And it's something that needs to sort of be brought in. So it's a kind of general consciousness of a certain, probably a certain generation of architects where the facility of TV and the, you know, the reach of TV was always there, where architecture seemed like a limitation.
Oh, that's interesting. So again, I think it's I hear you saying kind of like TV allows you to bring reality to architecture. It's not like architecture is this real thing, and then we can sort of derealize it or dematerialize it with TV. It's kind of the other way around. You're going to use TV to kind of get to the reality of architecture. I think, of course, of Gideon's argument about space-time and architecture and so on, a kind of, and here he's a kind of appealing to Einstein and Moholy-Nagy's complex visual machines and so on. And in a certain way, what you're saying resonates with that, except TV is the magic word that replaces relativity or space-time or any of those kinds of things. You can't, basically, to change the way we think about architecture, you just look in the corner of the living room and say, oh, there's the mechanism right there.
Yeah, and it's so obvious, and we sleepwalk through it all because it's just so much part of our consciousness.
Right.
It's just that some of what it has is not obvious and available always to architects, and sometimes it has to be called out, but it's such a natural thing.
Yeah.
So that dimension, that ability to communicate the lightness of the screen and the moving image. I mean, I will say something that this is also, it has some complexity to it. There's a point at which architects try to dematerialize architecture to such an extent that they projected images on buildings, you know, and to me, that always seemed kind of like cheap, you know, because you can't dematerialize.
I mean, not expensive enough.
Well, you know, I mean, it's the same argument about glass sort of not being there and extending space forever. Glass is material, it can break, it's expensive, it has thermal qualities. And video it's very material. It's sort of, you know, it has a kind of physical presence, it has to be constructed. You don't use one against each other, like against the other that way to undo some kind of other problem. But you sort of have to, you take them both together, and it's a kind of consciousness of different kinds of reality at the same time. They're parallel.
Yeah, I super agree with that. I mean, I think that because you know I'm a bottom feeder of the television world and I'm addicted to it. So of course for me TV is real, and architecture is not. Architecture is sort of this fragile effect, even when made out of, you know, metal and stone and glass and all of that. It's actually a very fragile thing, and that's its beauty. That's why I'm very happy to be in the world of architecture, because this thing that everybody else just thinks is so solid and so immobile actually is super fragile and delicate, and is very provocative and precarious. And so for me, it's similar to you a little bit. I think I feel that the electromagnetic waves and everything of the technology of television are the world we live in, actually. And then architecture is this interesting effect, kind of vestigial effect that sort of floats in the middle of all that. And to understand television better may be a way to kind of, you know, not necessarily change architecture, but sort of to see it as actually appearing within a kind of television environment. Maybe architects have always thought that there was architecture, and then there was TV added, and actually it was an annoying guest because it was rude. Like, it just didn't matter where it was, it gave the same signals, and the signals themselves didn't even stop, they just go through concrete. So we always thought this is just not a very welcome and tacky thing. But I think it's sort of the other way around, that everybody's living in the world of signals, and architecture is the guest, right? So we could make that guest more interesting.
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always, like, I'm just trying to think back to, you know, my childhood is equated with TV. So TV was
Right,
always on and always on everywhere. And I had this sort of interest in certain sitcoms that were in suburbia. So my apartment and let's say Dennis the Menace's house or Leave It to Beaver's house or even Dick Van Dyke and others like that, those were extensions of the space. I didn't
right,
differentiate it precisely where my couch ended and theirs began. It
right.
was prevalent and it was just always there as part of consciousness. So I don't see it as something, I don't know. It's hard to think about that because it's like just one of the normal things in the palette, you know, like it's a bricks and mortar and moving image. It's
Right.
always
So
there.
yeah, right. So if you're a human, I mean, I don't know, maybe you and I, we're not, but let's say if we were humans, one of the symptoms of that would be that, like almost everybody else on the planet, we live in those extended spaces and times of television. I mean, and it's remarkable that architects who say that they care about humans precisely don't care about this architecture, this televisual architecture, which, as you say, is the architecture we literally grew up in. In my case, of course, since we're on the Zoom couch here, TV was banned from my childhood. So my childhood is without television, or you could say it another way around. My childhood began when I left home and started to watch TV.
Oh
And
no,
and
this
watching
explains
TV
a
is an
lot.
inadequate expression for it. But you
That's
touched,
so
but let's
interesting.
getting back to you. It's interesting that you, of course, notice in the TV that you're watching the architecture of Dennis the Menace. Like you actually see the spaces, and who knows what it means to be an architect. But part of it is, of course, sort of seeing spaces that actually are like environments. And in as much as they're environments, they're not seen by actually regular people. So in other words, the architect is this sort of strange creature that thinks that everyday spaces are somehow foreign and exotic and strange. Actually, it's something like the child, right? Like the child that finds everything unbelievably interesting.
Right,
So,
right.
so in a certain way, you already saw in your TV, or you remember now seeing the kind of architect. You know, this is one step further from what we've said so far. That inside this world of signals, this architecture of signals,
Right.
which has its visible technology and its invisible technologies, there is literally architecture being drawn, like,
Yeah.
and I mean, occupiable architecture.
This is why when we think about probably when some people joined the TV world, it
Yeah,
was when there was a moon landing or there's something significant and it's important, right? That there's something important for which one needs to connect to the rest of the planet, and or to just watch something sort of significant like Planet Earth, you know, to learn something from TV. But for me, TV was part of the everyday banal of
right,
life. It was
right,
just an
right,
extension of the living room. That's why those particular shows are meaningful. I didn't like westerns, for example, because I couldn't identify with it. So there were these spaces that I could identify with that were just contiguous with the space that I was in, and I loved kid actors because I was a kid, and
hmm,
so it was an extension of my world. I didn't have friends when I was a kid because I didn't speak English. When my parents parked me in front of the TV because that was the way I learned the language,
yeah.
and it was my, you know, those were my friends for the first 3 years, I think, until I was in third grade. So, um,
So
so I
actually,
don't know.
you had lots of friends. They just couldn't hear you because
They couldn't hear me. Yeah,
they were
yes,
busy in the busy making their programs.
right, right. But you know, I wanted to. I don't know if this is off topic, but I am just remembering an experience I had, which is sort of like everything the other way around, where I had a physical architectural experience where the media was just somehow it was everywhere and was like a consciousness of a city that I never had, and that led to the My Long Opera actually. But this was I got off the plane in Milan, and there was I had to go someplace to find someone. I had an appointment, and I was trying to find the building, and the streets were empty because the World Cup was on. And it was, you know, people had their windows open everywhere. It was warm. And I could hear the World Cup as I walked up and down the streets everywhere. And the streets were empty. And I had this sort of sense of an empty city that was connected. All these people were connected. I couldn't see them by this event that was in real time. And it got me really thinking about, you know, the potential of that real-time connection with people that doesn't happen. It only happens in physical space when we're together, and it happens on TV.
Right. And it's astonishing. And it's completely astonishing. And we always forget about it. And it could be, you know, a nightmare. Everybody seeing the same thing in the same way at the same time with the same emotions and all controlled and linked to buying and selling certain products and yourself being some kind of product or material or raw material, right? It could be this, but it could also be like ecstatic, like as you say, even before you make an opera, it's opera already. It's like, and you know, football, you know, opera is a subset of football. You know, opera is just a sort of minor version of football, and that's my view. I mean, football might be sort of another name for television, right? Like this, a name for this.
When you go to a match, would you prefer to watch it on TV or watch it in the stadium, watching the TV in the stadium? I know, Mark, you are drawn to screens all the time, as long as I've known you. You watch multiple screens at the same time.
Yes.
Right? So you can split your attention. But I'm wondering, is there any value to you actually being in a stadium and watching a match?
You know, I watch every game that's being played on the planet. You know that, right? In pretty much every continent. When people heard about that, they needed to save me, and they would save me by, for example, I was once flown to London to watch a football game by a big Liverpool fan. And she called me the night before the game and said, "You have never actually seen them, right?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Can you come tomorrow?" I said, "Yes." I flew, I landed, had lunch at the River Cafe, and walked to Craven Cottage, which is just down the river from there, and watched Liverpool Fulham. And then went to the airport and came home.
Would that be Richard Rogers, by the way?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
No. It was Richard Rogers, you know, Sue's restaurant. But you know, but the thing is that it is so different. And I have to say that it's not really answering your question, but for the first time in my life, when I felt the inadequacy of television was 9/11, because as you know, Beatrice and I were somehow in the middle of that, and actually it's to you know, to your apartment with Rick's apartment that you kind of saved us. But I realized in this moment that we had seen so much that never made it to the single most exposed event in human history. So I would say for the first time, I really got a kind of palpable sense of the distinction between the televisual world, let's say, and the world, in this case, a terrorist act that was designed for TV. So it's not about like there's the TV world and then there's the real world. This is the real world set up for TV. And I realized the inadequacy. Same in the football game. I think it's an entirely different.
I remember because I was on the phone with you and Beatrice, and you were explaining that you couldn't see out.
Yeah.
And you were explaining the scent, the smell, the stench. Yeah. And it was impossible. I was in Maine and I was watching it on TV, of course. And I was trying to, just through your descriptions, you know, get that feeling, which
so it's a sad, you know, and it was a very sad day. And of course, in the United States, in this moment, more people are dying each day than happened on that day. Nevertheless, it's somewhat etched in your soul, and we only knew what was happening by virtue of, I mean, it felt like our building was coming down. It was jumping up and down, but on TV you could see the cloud, and we knew that we were at the center of that cloud, right? So there was a very, you know, it's not just that the world was different, that what we experienced was different. Part of that experience was also included, you know, TV. But the reason I mean, this is, let's say it's not so interesting that, of course, we carry this memory every day, but it somehow just touches this. other sense of the multiple spaces and multiple times in which we live in. And I noticed that I think in your work also, there's a lot of attention to this multiplicity of space-time. And maybe we can walk through some of the projects, because I think my sense is that, I don't know when you and Rick started the office, but it's sort of in the early 80s. Is that right?
That's right.
And pretty early on, and I can think of one example, but maybe you think earlier. In around about 87 or so, I think there's two things in which you did something called Body Buildings. And there was a kind of sort of like a gallery show. And in the middle was a kind of TV, but you didn't let it behave like a TV. If I remember rightly, you could only see it through a mirror or something, but a TV it was. And therefore a certain domesticity was produced in the space of your exhibition. Like you knew it was the familiar thing, but it was also not different. And is it the same year that you do the withdrawing room, where you literally go into a domestic space, or was that 88? You go into a domestic space, a house, and you literally sort of disembowel a television, and you, the viewer, I mean, you have to tell me what you think the work was, but what I remember was every element of the television watching experience was almost forensically exposed. The chair in which you sit is somehow now in the air, as is the TV. But give us your take on what that was. Because that's 87, 88, something like this, right?
Yeah, in that period, this is a useful conversation, because I don't exactly remember what led to what, but there was a consciousness of the TV as an artifact, as a thing. It has, you watch it at a certain height, you're aligned with it. It actually has a flat screen, but the body isn't flat. And it's not there magically, it's connected by wires. And it weighs something. And when we did the Cap Street project, we exposed all of that, as we exposed the bed and the dining table. And we took that David Ireland house apart and dissected it, one domestic element after another, with the various rituals and social relations. In the disemboweled TV that you're talking about, that was at the storefront, that was, it was just an object we made. It was a way to, in a way, expose the sort of natural of the TV, which is unnatural. So to see it from a screen over a mirror, there's a 45-degree mirror over a screen that's rotated horizontally. So, and it's sitting in a table, sort of cradled in a steel table. And we see all of the wires and everything draping below. But the reflection is now right side up, where the TV is sort of not opposite the viewer as a kind of thing in space. And you just see it through this very, very thin, almost dimensionless reflection. There's a fascination between the 2D, between real and virtual stuff, right? Things that are brought to us virtually through a cathode ray or electronic screen. It's sort of magically there. And but we argued in a lot of projects then and subsequently that the sort of physical material reality, the authenticity of a thing, and a virtual image of a thing they're actually interrelated, and they're parallel, and they're interesting when seen together. And, very often it sort of led to some work around the question of mediated experience, that you, let's say, have a video image of something like, yeah, like the slow house or something. You see a view on a TV monitor, and somehow it's less important than seeing the real thing, or a performer on stage. We see that performer on a screen, and we see their physical body in space. One is typically socially regarded as inferior and so-called mediated, which means inauthentic.
Right.
And in my education, authenticity was everything. This was Cooper Union. And I just rebelled against that, because what is more authentic than an image on a TV?
Exactly.
Right?
You see, this is the sound that you and I make, right? Which is the sound of you know, we are asking for respect for television, right? That the authenticity and materiality, the phenomenology, even, let's say, the philosophical integrity, the informational complexity, the multidimensionality, all of these great things of TV need to be celebrated. I mean, if I look at the David Island House, I see your argument. You had to take apart the TV because you were taking apart every element of domesticity. So there, it just got cut up like everything else, right? And sectioned and rearranged. And of course, I love the project because you know, if you're instead of inhabiting the house, you sort of inhabit the architect's sort of three-dimensional drawings of the house. So you kind of inhabit the analysis of the house rather than the house itself. So, but in the gallery, no excuse. Nobody asked you to bring a TV in there. So it's actually you making a little bit of a house out of the gallery by bringing in this TV and then twisting it a bit. So people can still say, oh, well, that's an art object, but it's an object. I recognize that object. It's from my house, but it's been turned upside down. By the time you get to Slow House, you kind of combine the two things because now the entire house, as it were, comes out of the TV set. So the house is sort of like the architect of the house. And I'm jumping ahead, and maybe we can get to the Slow House. We have to get to the Slow House, right? Like it's kind of like the end game of this conversation, right? In terms of the things we've said so far. But somewhere in between that early stuff and Slow House, there is Parasite, right, at MoMA, which again, you kind of bring in TVs, but you bring in so many of them that it's sort of half domestic because there's also chairs and stuff, but it's also a little bit getting into the kind of shopping mall surveillance TV world. And of course, that was the MoMA of, of the renovation that was very sort of shopping mall-esque and so on. So you kind of get into the surveillance, commodity, domesticity. The TV starts to become at the center of a series of different TV worlds, probably all of which remain important for your work. But so maybe just to touch Parasite a little bit, what do you have any fond memories of that? Like,
well,
do you remember it?
Sure. No, I do remember it because we returned to MoMA a couple of times in different roles. And that was the role when we were invited to MoMA to do the projects room, which was an invited commission. And the museum doesn't know what it's going to get before. And we sign a contract with them and they just have to show what's there unless it's unsafe or something like that. So they were not very pleased actually with what we did. And this was in the period of the institutional critique. And we thought, okay, invited into the museum to do a project. And we were anti-institution, anti-museum. Our work was typically in found spaces, borrowed spaces. And here we were asked to go right into the center of power. How could we do it? In our world at that point, we had to be architects there critically. So we wouldn't just show our work on a pedestal, we would take on the space of the museum. And we had a gallery that was very across the lobby from the front door, close to the sculpture garden. And we decided to sort of witness these thresholds of transition between municipal space, where you can do what you want, sort of, as long as it's not against the law. And then the moment you crossed into an institutional space, that threshold of the revolving door coming in. And, also the escalators going up to the next level. So those were points of departure and transition. There were also commercial spaces. That was the Caesar Pelli.
Exactly.
And it felt like a shopping mall. So it was like a double-edged critique. And we put surveillance cameras in these locations and we brought those signals into the gallery. And we looked at them from these perspectives of fictitious viewers. And so we were looking at looking.
Right.
It was a kind of meta project for us.
Right. And people, I would guess that nobody could figure out whether you were artists or architects, right? I mean, probably in as much as there was TV sets and cameras and stuff like that, maybe you would be identified with artists, like, artists working with video and surveillance and stuff like that. And in as much as there was this kind kind of super technical, three-dimensional theatrics of space and so on, maybe you would be recognizably architects, and yet the two things were not that separate. So
Right.
probably it was not clear. I don't know if somebody said to you at that time, you know, if somebody was interviewing you, whether you would declare allegiance to one or the other, but you were sort of a mixture, right? A mixture.
Yeah, no, we were always like, we never felt the need to say what we did or to defend it in one camp or another, or one discipline or another. It felt absolutely, you know, we were trained as architects. I was teaching architecture, Rick was teaching architecture. We were doing independent art projects, installations, but they were always around space, and that's where architecture is the continuous line
Right.
through all of this.
Right.
We weren't building buildings at that time, but to us to examine and look critically at the space of the museum, at those critical thresholds, at how to engage the real-time viewer in the gallery.
Right.
So that there was a different sensation than just looking at art on the wall. Those were spatial problems, and
Right.
they felt very architectural to us, even though the materials weren't bricks and mortar.
Right.
And by the way, we had a very particular way of engaging the physical museum also. We didn't just hang anything on a wall. We scraped into a wall. We took things down. It was a very parasitic
the
relationship.
word was right? The word was very precise to the installation.
The word was very precise because it's not only sort of, well, there were three ways that the word was right. One, it was physically parasitic, like it clawed on the walls and it hacked at the electrical, and it did all of those things that we sort of got the benefit of taking what the museum sort of was there physically. But we also earned our welcome by flattery, you know, in that form of parasite. And then the Michel Serres form of parasite, it's like the signal, sort of messing with the signal, the communication signal. And that's what we felt we were doing. We were sort of producing an irritation in the space of the museum.
Right. So I think you were also parasites on architecture, and that's why nobody could figure out if you were art or architecture. And as much as you're not in the middle of architecture, maybe you're to do with art, and yet you didn't seem to ever leave architecture. So you have this sort of parasitical relationship. And I think the plan here was that you should never be really an architect that actually makes stuff. Like, I think to everybody that sees you as the parasite,
can I just say, I have to say one thing because I feel like there's a segue coming on. I just want
There's
to say
always a
something
segue coming on. Yeah.
I want to say something about static, you know, because it's something when we look at TV, and especially those old signals on TV, there's a point at which broadcast goes off and you see snow, right?
Yeah.
Digital snow. And so parasite sort of creates that kind of disturbance, which also creates snow and static. And that, you know, we tried very hard to design snow for TV. And it's a very, very hard thing to do because you have to work with all the different shades of gray and the durations that they are, and make it really feel like it's random. And
when did you do that, Liz?
We did it for one of our theater projects. I think it was for a moving target, where we have like intermittent disruptions in the video connection, and we had to actually design that snow.
Is that before or after the Blur building?
It's around the same time. It's all a blur to me. I don't know.
but it's the same. It's to some extent the same. Kind of.
It's an interest in not high res, but sort of low res, and making sort of problems for vision. Yeah.
Well, I think there is a possibility of high resolution blur. Like, I mean, not, you know, when the theory here is to use this new book that I wrote, not to talk about it, right? But I have to mention this one thing. A big part of the argument is to say that the way that Waxman engages with TV, like with the images behind us, is to produce what I think of as a high resolution blur. Like, he's interested in architecture becoming less determinate and to become fuzzy and floaty. And the paradox is he does that with a very meticulous engineering. In this sense, it's common with you and Rick, right? There's very, very precise techniques to produce a kind of experience of a lack of limits, right? So when I'm
Mhm.
very fascinated in your attempt to design snow. By the way, it's just as a biographical question. Have you ever watched, remember they used to scramble TV channels in hotels and so on if you were not paying for them? Did you ever watch, and the effect was snow within which you could sort of see shadowily, you could actually see the program, but typically divided by a horizontal line. So actually you would see the bottom of the image on the top and the top of the image on the bottom, and all sort of twisted. I thought it
Yeah,
was
and it has
astoundingly beautiful.
like a
Yeah, but
erratic
I used to watch
vision.
whole films that way, because after a while, if you stare, I mean, this is just a kind of confession that maybe shouldn't be broadcast, as they say, but if you look for long enough, after a while, you can mentally reassemble the image, or at least construct an image. I think this is also one of the advantages of blurs, right? Is that you can, or let's say blurs that secretly have a certain shape. They're not as blurry as they first seem, so that actually you can go into them also intellectually and emotionally and in fantasy. You can see
Right,
what you want to
right.
see, right? Or see what you're afraid to see, even.
Yeah, yeah. You work at it. It's more engaging, immersive, right? Because
Yeah,
otherwise you're in a passive relationship to a given image. But when you have to struggle to understand it, you're in it.
right.
I
So
totally.
and that space frame, that sort of space frame that you made in order to project the water to produce the droplets that produce, it's got to be like a covoid nightmare, right? It's a droplet maker.
It actually would be really good in COVID because it's
You get
actually
washed all the
water.
time.
Ultimately, yeah,
Yeah.
it's just heavier than air, and so it settles down and cleans the space in front of you.
So actually you could go there and have it full of virus and have it like land on you and be washed off at the same time, as the sort of ultimate experience, right? It's
Well,
sort of,
it's interesting that you mention that, because the whole issue with atomized water is that it has to be cleaner than the water you drink, because our lungs are incapable of
keeping it
um,
out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's just like, our intestines could take out the bacteria if there's bacteria there, but our lungs are incapable of doing that. So the water has to be that pure,
Right. Oh, we see,
right?
of
Because
course,
we're inhaling half of it.
I love this, because of course you're receiving the cloud intravenously. And this is very much in the spirit of radio and television. This is also, I think, why architects are so fearful in general of television, because it seems to come inside. It's so, that's what I meant before. So disrespectful of the limits, the sort of prophylactic. If you think of architecture as a kind of prophylactic profession, which it is, like a kind of expertise in prophylactics, the television seems to sort of undo that at some level, and this undoing is somehow welcomed. It's not just popular; it's like the popular. But let's sort of, since you rightly sensed a segue, I wonder, by the way, if you had to draw a segue, what it would look like, but it wouldn't be exactly a bridge, but something like that.
Yeah,
If
it's a
we,
fork in the road. It's a fork in the road.
exactly, something as simple as that. Okay, so
Somebody's narrating which way.
yeah, or somebody shut off one of the ways, right? So it's sort of censorship.
Yes.
So here
Right.
begins the censorship. If I think of Slow House, right, in terms of this idea of, first of all, interrogating television as part of, not just part of the domestic environment, but a super important part, right? Like just as the bed and the table and all those other things are, and the door and the window and so on. And then the idea that you choose that particular piece of domestic apparatus to populate your own exhibitions. In other words, when you head into the sort of so-called art world or the world of exhibition, the piece of the domestic world you bring with you is the TV set, even if it's rendered otherwise. And in the Slow House, it kind of works in reverse, because now you unambiguously, seems to me, I know these are boring classifications, but you and Rick are in a sort of direct way saying, well, we're making a house and we're architects and we made the drawings and now we're making the building and so on. And yet this house is not a house with a TV, as it were, in it, but more like a space that takes its geometry from the TV image and from the need to gather a TV, so it's sort of, the architecture is sort of positioned between receiving the image of the horizon and projecting the image of the horizon, but also westerns and all that other stuff. So suddenly now we have architecture with a capital A, literally kind of coming out of TV and shaped by TV. Is this more or less accurate?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, that the TV finds itself at the picture window at the end of the house, and also opposite the chimney, which is the official other center of the house. So between the TV as a kind of family gathering place and the hearth, we have these two things juxtaposed. But for us, it was even more important that the form of the house was to be this picture window. And the TV was to disrupt that clear view through the picture window. So there was a big boom that came out, and the TV was right there. Now, in this case, TV can switch to broadcast, but it could also switch to real-time transmission. So on top of the chimney, we actually have a camera, a live camera, that's looking out to this beautiful view of the sea and the horizon, which you see out of the picture window. And with a flip of a switch, you can go from watching Dallas or whatever you're watching to watching the horizon and the view outside on your TV that's framed by the picture window that's looking at the same view. But what you can do is you can also record it, so you can have good weather and bad weather. You could have day during night. You could zoom in on somebody on a motorboat out there. And so you can be like a real-time director of that TV. But the sort of underlying issue that we were getting at with the house was that that sort of precious view, having a house in the Hamptons and being by the sea and having that view, that the house and the way it frames a view and the picture window, which is a normal part of architecture, is producing a value on something that's already there. You step out and there's the view, it's already there. But the moment you capture it in the frame of the picture window, you're somehow now domesticating it, and it becomes a different kind of value. And our point was that the value that's inside of the picture window is exactly the same thing as on the TV. One is no less real, one is no less authentic than the other.
Right. So since we still have our couch with us, I can't help but remember that as a child, you thought of yourself as being in a contiguous landscape. So in a way, you managed to make a house, the first house in a way that you guys make. And in a sense, in my mind, it was built. I know the foundation started and then the project, ultimately didn't get completed, but in a sense it's completed, right? And this first statement of, okay, and now we really build like an object out in the world that's people are gonna live in. It will take the form of the sort of this idea of somehow that what you see on the screen and what you see out the window and what you feel yourself to be inside is contiguous. So again, you kind of also expand, let's say, the dimension of the house by allowing its outside to become part of its inside. But if I remember rightly, the TV is pretty thin in that one, right? It kind of moves. It can move. Is it relatively thin? It's not a flat screen, but it's become thinner.
It's big. It's giant. It's as big as you could imagine getting a TV screen. And
it's not so deep. It's not so deep, right? The depth is actually it's like as if the geometry has gone into the house itself, right? Instead of the house being sort of more or less neutral thing with this piece of sculpture in the middle, the sculpture is sort of flattening down. It's sort of halfway towards becoming a flat screen in my mind. And it's on some sort of boomer, right? It can move. But the house has taken what look like kind of projection lines. I know they're not, but it's kind of like a banana, but it's like they are radiating. They're kind of radiating, it's sort of like a radioactive house. You know what I mean?
It's good to get your read of it. It's a slow curve. So slow house partially has to do with a kind of unfolding spiral. geometrically. And so when we drew the house, all the radiating lines that sort of set up the sort of the curve have to do with that geometric principle. But also it's there's a morph from a door to a window. So so there's a very tall door, skinny door, and so the front facade of the house is only the width of a door, but it's very high. And the end of this banana of this house is this giant picture window. And one of the walls is vertical as it grows higher, higher, higher. The other wall, as it grows higher, 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 it starts to bend a little bit like a Serra sculpture.
Right.
So that it gets its kind of trapezoidal form from those kind of moments. But, I think that, I can't help but think, as you remind me of all of this, that this was in 1989, 90 or something like that. And I was teaching I was a student at Cooper in the 70s, and I was teaching at Cooper from like 81 through 90 something, 90, I think, or 91. And authenticity was what John Haydock saw. That was my education. It was it was about the real. And from the first moment on, I challenged that, and I must have channeled all of that, talk about being on the couch, all of that indoctrination, which, by the way, he was like a guru for me, but I absorbed half of it and I rejected the other half. But part of that was that this dismissal of certain things as being inauthentic, and the notion of mediated and inauthentic came together. And and what I was always sort of challenging was this notion of why is mediated a bad thing? Mediated means you get in the way, you change the nature of something, but it doesn't have any less value than something undisturbed.
Right. And I think that's the trick. That's actually, even you could say, the audible trick in this case, because you cherish authenticity, but authenticity is now attached to mediation. And the very thing that would be inauthentic for John is the very site for your work. And I remember Battery's writing so beautifully about another aspect, which is this way in which the view through the car window channels, gets then channeled into the view out of the picture window. So the house somehow acts as a sort of a joint between two mediated mobile views, right? The windscreen to the screen of the house, or to say it another way around, the house has its own kind of windscreen, or you sort of one windscreen becomes another screen, becomes another screen. So the house is a series of screens, right? And it goes to that point you just made, that the connection between media as well, not just any one media getting any one set of authenticities, but actually what seems to be authentic is the multiplications within and between and overlapping of media. Does it sound like I'm saying too much?
Yeah.
Or
No, that's right. And it's this notion of sort of being in between things, that somehow experience is authentic at all. Like, I think it's just challenging authenticity in and of itself, not saying everything. I mean, one can think of it as, or maybe not just making this distinction between the authentic world and the inauthentic world, that's a blur. And, when I think back on my earliest sort of, heroes, it was Duchamp, who took stuff out of the normal world and just did something like turn it upside down or 90 degrees and change the nature of it. And it's that notion of just seeing something through a slightly different lens and expressing it to someone else. And it need not be, hitting you over the head with something. It could be a very, very small shift that changes a behavior. And that's the kind of interference, the kind of parasite, the kind of just looking at something that is so conventional in a slightly different way. And I think that it permeates really all the work.
Right, and it's really all the work. Like, I think, if I think I can think of just I'm sure I don't know all your work, but I can think of like 10 projects in which the cameras are inside or outside or moving, or the screen, or you're receiving signals or generating signals, or the camera is scanning the building that you're in and giving you the image of it, or you're looking into a building on the other. Like, it's really, it just never stops. It's sort of like, it's a sort of encyclopedia of the possible ways in which TV and architecture would be inseparable, right? Or it's like you stitching them. I mean, maybe it implies a certain nervousness, right? That if you don't stitch it so much,
well,
they may come apart. Like, in the end, it might turn out that architecture is architecture and TV is TV.
Yeah, but I think it just somehow it's an irrepressible need to always point out that experience is always mediated, and architecture is nothing but a mediating device,
Right.
like any form of media. And if you take the ICA as an example, and the MediaTek, which is just like one place where it's like a little grandstand that hovers from the underside of the building that looks at Boston Harbor, but only frames the water and doesn't show the horizon or anything else. And it's like a screen. People think it's a screensaver, like a giant screensaver,
Right.
but it's not mediated. It's just a framed view. And
Right.
it's as simple as that. Architecture does that all the time. And sometimes we just want to push it a little bit over the edge to
Right.
make everyone a little bit more conscious of what
Right.
it does.
Right. So now we loop around, right? Because getting back to where we started, and I suppose we are getting near the end here, that if TV is fascinating for you and in your work with Rick, because somehow it actually accesses the multi-dimensional, strange, experiential nature of architecture, right? So it's less about displacing architecture and more about understanding what makes it work or how it works, that it's media, right? Mm-hmm. If this is the case, then the kind of, it is a challenge to the way, architecture is normally thought, but the challenge is just to invite architects to look more closely at what it is that they are in fact doing. And I have become more or less convinced that most architects are, in their own minds, TV programs, right? And that they are, large productions, and that they are the main actors in a drama. There's a lot of production, and there are complex sets of audiences and so on. And so the weird thing is, architects are quite expert at this architecture as media thing you're describing. And yet, if you ask them what is architecture, what they will broadcast is a message that no, architecture is almost the opposite of signals. It's almost like, it's almost could be even a defense against, for example, the sort of hyper-connected digital world. So I kind of would just curious maybe that we could just finish with a few thoughts about, because here television has obviously just been a word for something that, as you said right at the beginning, is literally that object that sits in the room and brings you the world, but is also so many other things as well. And that after a while, the word television just sort of heads into the televisual or something like that. And I'm just curious whether the digital, if there is such a thing, is in your mind like this, just more of that, or it's something different. Like, when we talk about TV and the televisual and media and so on, is that a different conversation than the one about the digital in general and data in general and all of that? Or for you, they're very tightly together? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have an answer to this. I'm just curious.
I don't know if I.
Because you're super digital, right? You do, and a lot of your work involves computation. I don't just mean, you have fancy computers in your office. I mean, the work itself participates. I think, for example, of the big data visualization project you did with Laura Kurgan and others, right? You have really worked on data as a material for the architect, right?
Right. Well, it's part of the whole spectrum. It's that we're used to watching on TV and in our image obsessed world. We're used to watching, to seeing photos and videos and getting our sort of reality fix from those things. But what if data came to you in such a way that had such emotional impact by just seeing the numbers or just seeing maps, and translations of the world into graphic material or into signals or into numbers? And what we did with Exit is we showed, and this was one of the motives of the piece, to through data mining and through sort of looking at hundreds of data sites, of telling the story of world migration for political, economic, and environmental reasons on a world map, on an unfolded world map, with animated pixels. And that's all we did. And it was 45 minutes of storytelling without photos, without conventional videos. But it was incredibly emotional. And that was the challenge. That was the great challenge that we made for ourselves. That could we grip everyone's attention and understand the poignancy of the casualties of war, just through seeing the data in a different way, other than just a flat map, on a screen, just a static map. I do think of all of these things as, I don't think of them as distinct from one another, using data as a tool, or using live video as a tool, or recorded video, or bricks and mortar. I mean, to me, these are all of there are just so many different tools. It's just like figuring out what the task is and getting the right tool for the task. Sometimes it means inventing a new tool.
Right. Right. So I could go on for hours, of course, and you would stop listening, and so too would the audience. But I think that the thing that I hold on to is this thing that you referred to, which I never had heard before, and I sometime we should talk again, I think, about this. Actually, the implication of what you said was you didn't succeed in designing snow. Like, it was so difficult.
It's very difficult. We simulated it.
Right. So not the same, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, authenticity is everything. So snow has to be really snow. So the funny thing is, snow is sort of there. It was always crucial part of television, as is noise in any system. So the thing that's always there is actually the hardest thing to replicate or emulate rather than simulate. And I think, to the extent that architects, if we can speak of the architect as a kind of species, their desire to be different from TV, that fear of TV, also means sort of not being able to grasp the televisual dimension of architecture itself, and therefore not really be able to participate in political or aesthetic or emotional. It's kind of massively neutralizing sentiment. And of course, I'm not a witness that anybody would trust, because I love television so much. So I could be easily dismissed as a TV addict and guilty as charged. And yet, I think, for those architects, of which there are many, who would deeply love to be engaged more in the real social conditions and inequities of our society and so on, seems to me whatever we mean by that word television remains the way into that potential. And that's why I think the fact that you are rare in the sense, you and Rick are rare in the sense that if you remove the TV, you remove everything. This is a sort of a sign. It's very odd that our field is so allergic to television, right?
Well, it was, it's people are ashamed to admit that they watch television.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of it. And also, you and I talk about this a lot, like sometimes the sort of the more banal, the better. And but it also has a kind of ability to wash all over you, just, it's the signal, it's being engaged in sound and motion and vision. I do a lot of work while I have reality TV on in the background, and it's a kind of half attention that I think is sort of part of our world, that you can do multiple things at the same time, but the presence of that TV allows you to have this sort of multiple channels of your attention.
Right.
And you could just turn it off and on super easily. You can,
right.
And some people just can't do that. And they see the turning on the TV as like some kind of ethical or moral problem, that you sink to. But, I do think that pop culture is, I don't make such a huge separation between pop and high culture, whereas other architects do. And I
Right.
think maybe that's also the division. I'm not, I love to be in that world. I love to be immersed in it and, and sort of benefit from
Right.
it. So I think that's part of it, is that architecture somehow, and architects think of them as somehow sort of beyond, above
Right.
that. And
Right.
it's,
Which is
and
crazy,
just,
right?
just
They're
the opposite.
obviously,
Yeah.
yeah, they're obviously not above and beyond it because they're worried that if they turn the TV on, they can't turn it off. So actually, they are desperately afraid. I mean, this is the interesting thing. I think that neither you or I are ethical role models in any sense, and yet I think the adoption of an ethics in architecture will require an understanding of the televisual nature of architecture, even if, for example, one regrets it or condemns it or criticizes it as one should, to not, as it were, carry out that work, and to carry it out as architects and as scholars and so on. It seems to me the greatest risk of all. And perhaps if architecture is complicit with everything we despise in the kind of systematic inequities of our world, maybe its deepest complicity is to pretend that it's not engaged, right? That it's not, and I think this starts with this idea of thinking that architecture is the opposite of TV. And so I think there's a kind of pathway through architects who have thought TV, made architecture out of TV, like yourselves and this group that one can trace in the 20th and 21st century. And it's kind of work that has to happen. And I think it will happen. And maybe it will happen because people think that we no longer live in the world of TV, that we have gone, into a post-TV or an even deeper TV. Like, in other words, we're now in a position we could probably look back. And this book on Waxman is a kind of looking back. And what was great about talking with you is also just to show that it's also looking forward. And
Yeah.
speaking of which, I look forward to you and Rick finally designing some decent snow, because there's a
Okay.
project. There's
I
a
have to
project.
come back to that because it's almost, uh, you have to find the right algorithms now to do it. And I think it
Yeah,
can be done now better than
yeah,
it
yeah.
than
Not
when we
easy.
tried it before. I look forward to reading the book and
No. That's
understand this architect in a very different way. So,
yeah,
in through a filter of Mark Wigley that definitely sees the world. It's sort of in a submitting to these things that are complicated, and it's that thing that we're talking about, like admitting, to be able to observe the world in a way, and to be able to even be a critic of it, you have to submerge yourself in it and can't be totally outside of it. So
yeah.
you let yourself sort of allow it to wash all over you, and then I think you're better able to speak about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe not, but let's face it, we are TV, so
We
deal
are
with
too.
it. Deal
Yep.
with it, right? Anyway, it was great.
Okay.
See you soon, I
Take
hope.
care.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Over wine and food, please.
At the minimum.
Okay. All right.
Deal.
Bye.
Bye bye.